South Australia. Please have a seat. And also Martin Hála, Director of Sinopsis here in Prague, a fantastic think tank that does research on China. Thank you all. Thank you all. And as usual, we're going to take questions from the audience and also from Slido. Please start posting questions. I have this iPad here. Please start posting questions now so we can upvote for the ones you like. I'll keep an eye on them, and if it makes sense to bring in a question earlier because it's relevant to the conversation, I will do so, and we'll get through as many as possible. So the title of this panel is called Flashpoints in East Asia, Preparedness and Partnerships. I want to start with the Secretary General. I'm going to ask each of you actually a question on preparedness and then one on partnership. Now, you made the case just now for why Europe should care and how Taiwan can help. I want to, there are many aspects of preparedness when it comes to Taiwan, and I want to ask about Taiwan's mandatory military service, actually. Very recently increased to 1 year, and I was reporting from Taiwan and speaking to young people who have gone through this mandatory military service. This is what many of them told me. They described it as a joke. They said that they, yeah, indeed, and they said they felt like they were running around doing push-ups, and they didn't feel like they walked away as if they could be prepared to fight a war. And more specifically, just so for people here in the audience to better understand, because I was curious about what that meant too, I asked them some basic questions. For example, applying a tourniquet, which is a basic first aid skill you should know in a time of war. And the men I spoke to said that they had not been trained in learning how to apply a tourniquet. Now, this depends on the year in which this happened, but they also made reference to a feeling that they didn't have enough access to time on the shooting range, and that there seemed to be sometimes even not enough bullets to go around, right? So I'd like to get your reaction to what these young Taiwanese are saying and what I'm hearing on the ground. Is this true? And you talk about Taiwan's need for preparedness, and it doesn't sound like people feel like they're being prepared.
Well, this is a very good question, Vanessa. But if you have an opportunity to come to Taiwan again, visiting our training centers in Taiwan these days, I think you will get a different impression, and you will also get a very different response from the young people. And you are absolutely right that last year or the year before or a few years before that, the young people were complaining about waste of their time in the military training centers. When they do those 4 months conscript training, they're forced to run around, painting stones, picking grass with their hands, things like that. And many people are saying that it's complete waste of time. And our Ministry of National Defense try to understand why the young people are feeling that way. So they look into their own training programs and they try to make adjustment. And actually, last year, we started to borrow the textbooks from the United States. And the military trainings nowadays are following the US standard. So earlier this year, I had a couple of times to visit our training center and saw that our young people actually are training exactly like what Americans are training their soldiers. And talking about the first aid, that was the first part of their training. So the young people who are trained by our military nowadays, they are more prepared. And other than that, I would like to say that the American trainers on the ground, they help train our soldiers, the professional soldiers, to be able to better protect our countries. And after intensive trainings by the US trainers, we spoke with them, and they show so much more confidence in their ability and their determination in defending Taiwan. So the situation has changed. And of course, we understand that Chinese have that ambition in taking Taiwan over by force if necessary. And therefore, we understand that seriousness in our defense is absolutely critical. And we are making more investment. We're training our soldiers for asymmetrical warfare. And we're getting very serious about training our soldiers in a decentralized manner. And we are also procuring weapons for the asymmetric strategy, things like that. So I think the whole country now is looking at defense in a very different light now. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. So they will know how to apply a tourniquet, because that's something I learned as well in hostile environment training. Yes, the second question on partnerships. I'd like to see if you could tell us a little bit about the state of Taiwan's homegrown defense industry. There's the submarine that we have seen, but I'm more curious about the equipment being built or sort of designed for asymmetric warfare, and whether there's any interest not just in R&D, but also working with US defense startup companies, for example, like Palmer Luckey's Anduril, which I understand sold some equipment to Taiwan.
This is also a very important question for us. We try to procure military weapons from other countries, especially the United States, and it is very critical for our self-defense. But other than the procurement from the United States, we also have a very strong industrial base in Taiwan for our defense purposes. So we build the jet trainers, and actually the jet trainers are following the prototype of the earlier IDF jet fighters. So we can transform the trainers into real jet fighters in a short period of time. And we are also building our naval corvette, which is state-of-the-art equipment that we can count on. They're small, but they're very fast, and they're stealthy. And they are capable of firing some of the missiles built in Taiwan. And we are also building these kinds of ships for our Coast Guards. And we understand that in a time of war, we may need more Coast Guard. We may need to turn our Coast Guard into our naval ships. So those Coast Guard ships can be turned into our naval ships within a short period of time. So you can see the strength of Taiwan's defense industries. And we are also producing anti-ship missiles, air defense missiles, things like that. But that is not enough. And if you look at the international shortage of ammunitions or equipment, things like that, we are speaking with the United States to see whether Taiwan's industrial base can move into the US supply chain. So it's not only going to be good for Taiwan, it will also be good for the international community when they need more output from the US industries, and that is in the process.
Great. I'm actually going to, if you don't mind, go to the lone European on stage first. Martin, Hála, how do you think Europe should prepare for any disturbances in East Asia on that question of preparedness?
Yeah, thanks. I prayed that you wouldn't be as tough on me as you were on Secretary General Wu, so thanks for this question. I think in my mind, the state of preparedness in Europe for a potential crisis in East Asia is still rather poor. I think we still have this legacy of complacency here in Europe from the good decades after the end of the Cold War, when history ended and the world was flat and all that. And now that history has come around to call on us again, I think it's been taking us too long to wake up to this call. But there are some good signs, I would say, and I was actually quite encouraged yesterday by the speeches of President von der Leyen, and by her call for Europe to become, and I think if I can remember exactly what she said that Europe should become an intrinsically security project as well, which is a very new language. And I was also encouraged when she said that there would be a new position of the Euro Commissioner for Defense. And That, I think, could really help Europe enhance its strategic coherence, and perhaps to also bring forward some of the projects that Europe has started but never seem to have quite finished, like the various Indo-Pacific strategies, both by the individual member states and by the European Union itself. I think the strategies underlie the understanding, the growing understanding in Europe that there is this indivisibility of security between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. But it seems to me that very often these words are not really followed by specific action. Now, the one thing that I would really like to see would be some concrete contingency planning for the future crises in East Asia, so that we're not again caught off guard like we were when the Ukraine crisis started, but also not only in terms of preparedness, but also in terms of deterrence. Because I think the contingency planning, especially if properly communicated to the other side, can form a credible deterrence. The other side is probably less likely to start something reckless if they are aware that there's detailed planning on our side for such an occasion. And I think that might be the most important aspect, because I think deterrence is crucial in this case, because if a crisis starts in East Asia, particularly if there's a crisis around Taiwan, if there's a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, regardless of how that conflict might end, just the fact that the conflict would be initiated would be a huge tragedy that would have immediate impact on the whole world. So by that point, we would already have lost, all of us. So I think deterrence and any effort to prevent such a scenario from happening would be very welcome. And I think specific contingency planning on the European side, just like many other countries in the region do that, like Japan, for instance, could possibly help us towards that end.
Right. On the second question of partnerships, you mentioned Japan, but actually there is a question here that I think is relevant to actually roll in from Slido for Martin, just to follow up on that. Considering the state of today's world, can Taiwan, wait, this is not the right one because this just keeps moving. Okay, here it is. Do you agree that Europe should minimize economic cooperation with China? Could this diminish our leverage to impose effective sanctions in case of an invasion? Martin.
Well, I wouldn't say that we need to minimize the cooperation. I just think that we should be very careful about the cooperation and try to think strategically, and not just about the immediate economic benefit and economic efficiency, but also about long-term security impact. So it's, there's this process of de-risking in Europe, officially backed by the European Union. And I don't think the aim is to minimize the cooperation. It's just to make it more secure and mindful of Europe's long-term security. It's impossible to minimize or break the cooperation with the People's Republic of China right away, given China's economic standing in the world. But we should definitely be more careful about what exactly we're doing when we cooperate with the PRC.
Senator, you've been very patient. Thank you very much. Now, Australia, of course, being much closer to where we're talking about, what would you like to see happen in the next 2 to 3 years in terms of what Australia should do regarding peace and security in the region in terms of preparedness?
Well, thanks, Melissa. We look at it clearly through a lens of deterring conflict. And the objective, of course, is to have peace and security and stability in our region, which in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly across Asia, has been the most economically prosperous for the world and the real engine of growth, and we want to maintain that. So we look at deterrence through really 3 lenses. Deterrence by example, and that is where the Ukraine conflict and Russia's invasion is so important, setting the example of supporting Ukraine to victory, and that will help to create an environment of deterrence from activities or actions that could provoke conflict. Deterrence through defence investment and readiness and preparedness, as we were just discussing. And for Australia, that means ensuring that we continue to increase the rate of defence spending, which we've been doing for a number of years. In fact, our last government, when it was elected way back in 2013, was prescient enough to go with the commitment of increasing and restoring defence spending back to 2% of GDP. And of course, now we seek to drive it further. But that, if you go all the way back to 2013, was a very wise call at the time. Mm-hmm. And then deterrence through diplomacy. Now, diplomacy needs defence and that deterrence framework to have the space to do its job. But of course, that is crucial, and particularly crucial in our region, where the relationships, not just in how you deal with the PRC or otherwise, but critically with all of the other countries of the region, and helping them to have the strength, for example, to stand by the values and things that are important for them. ASEAN's work that they've been doing in relation to a code of conduct for the South China Sea is a crucial example of that, that ASEAN nations need to stand by the Philippines, one of their members, who has faced such aggression recently, and critically ensure that those rulings under UNCLOS are upheld and respected, and that is an important part of the deterrence framework, which requires our friends and our neighbours to equally be part of that diplomatic solution.
Great. I want to next move to talking a little bit about the partnership that we haven't really explicitly discussed, which is the United States. For each of you, is there a danger of aligning too closely with the United States? An American president's word is as good as his or her next 4 years. Secretary General Wu.
Well, thank you very much for that question, and that is a very touchy issue. Especially commenting on domestic politics is always dangerous for any diplomat. And I would like to say it in a very honest way, though. The United States has been the most important partner for Taiwan, especially in the area of security. And the United States has been providing security weapons, providing weapons, and also the training and services for Taiwan. And as Taiwan faces tremendous amount of military threat against Taiwan, that kind of partnership is very important. And we have been reassured by either the Republicans or Democrats that no matter who is in power, the support for Taiwan will continue. And
but the Republicans just took Taiwan off its platform, political platform, in this campaign. I mean, Trump just ripped that paper off, and I mean.
Some people told us that we shouldn't be too serious on platforms that just for one day, and then there will be substantive policies if they can take office. If you have a chance to look at the American Congress, there are Republicans and there are Democrats, and they fight all the time. But they continue to tell us there's one issue that unites them. That is Taiwan. And we can continue to count on either the Republicans or Democrats who want to continue to support Taiwan. And this is probably one of the most important factors of deterrence against the Chinese ambition of using force against Taiwan. And other than the United States, we would like to develop closer ties with Australia, with Japan, with Europe, with Canada, and etc. If the international community is showing support to Taiwan, it's going to be a very important factor of deterrence against China's aggression. And so far, we are seeing the international community showing more and more support for Taiwan. For example, in G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, G7 summit, in EU summit, etc. They commented on the importance of peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait, which is indispensable to global security and prosperity. And when they continue to say that, they are actually telling the Chinese leaders that Taiwan is not China's domestic affairs. It's international affairs that everyone else cares quite a lot about. And that factor is very important. And in that regard, I would like to express my appreciation to the Czech Republic again and again. The reason is because it's always sensitive to treat Taiwan senior officials. But the Czech Republic is willing to open its door for Taiwan, for me to be here, to speak publicly, for you to hear Taiwan's story. And that is going to increase the confidence of the Taiwanese people. And that kind of Taiwan story is going to strengthen the international support for Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you. Since you made reference to relations with Australia, Senator, can you talk about how you'd want Australia's relationship with Taiwan to move forward? Informally, of course, because there are no technical diplomatic relations. Are there other specific bilateral relationships you feel like should be strengthened?
So we do have a very strong relationship with Taiwan. It's an economy and a democracy within our region that we share many values with, close and strong trade ties with, and strong and good people-to-people relations with. And it's within that framework that absolutely we seek to continue to grow that. We've been very clear in relation to our position of wanting to see respect for Taiwan, of calling out Chinese military aggression that presents the great risk of miscalculation, of misadventure, and of escalation at some stage. And even if those actions of China that we saw, for example, in the days following the inauguration of the recent president, aren't intended to shift Taiwan at present, they do present enormous risk, as any type of military conduct like that does. And indeed, our own forces, when operating through the region, have been subject as well to Chinese aggression or Chinese actions that have endangered the lives of Australian personnel. So we see very clearly that there is a need for not just Australia, but our partners in the region and across the world, to be consistent and principled and predictable in the way in which we call out that type of behaviour that presents a risk to the stability of our region.
And I didn't forget that question about the relationship with the United States. Could you comment on that in terms of the dangers of aligning too closely with the United States? Is there such a thing?
Well, the United States is our closest, most trusted alliance partner for Australia. And we have deep, long relations there that have survived US administrations, Australian governments changing with great frequency on both sides of our great democracies, and have only gone from strength to strength in that regard. And just in the last few years, point of tension in some parts of Europe, but the signing of the AUKUS partnership, the now exchange where the United States is committed to sharing its nuclear-powered submarine technologies with Australia for us to be able to build nuclear-powered submarines in our country. They've only done that with one other country before in US history, and that's the United Kingdom. And for the first time in decades, we have got them to extend that partnership. And we have confidence that it enjoys bipartisan support across the US system. And it does so not just because of the relationship with Australia, but because of the desire to ensure that deterrence framework I spoke of before in the Indo-Pacific is strong, and that they see the role that we play there to deter aggression against Taiwan or aggression against any other regional partner needs to be as strong as possible, and requires a country like Australia to be in that position.
Thank you. Martin, same question.
Same question about the United States?
Yes.
Well, I think the US still is the indispensable country, as Madeleine Albright once, I hope it was Madeleine Albright, once said. And especially in the Indo-Pacific, it's hard to imagine any regional security architecture without the participation of the United States. But not even the United States can do it alone these days. The strategic balance of power has shifted especially over the last decade, quite dramatically. So even the United States needs allies. So I would actually flip the answer. Is the United States prepared for, to maintain these strategic alliances that it has itself built after the Second World War? And of course, we all worry about the result of the elections in the US. And during the first Trump administration the cooperation with allies was, less than stellar, I would say. So I would really see the danger in the, in the opposite end of the question. Like I worry that after the elections in the United States, we might again see some problems in their alliances with their traditional allies, including Europe.
And can I just
Yes,
quickly,
please.
Melissa,
Yes.
it's not obviously, yes, I defended the importance of that alliance with the US, but equally that building of partnerships out is crucial. Now, we've done that with the US, for example, in the formation of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, with India and Japan, as well as the US and Australia, providing an important framework for regional dialogue, particularly around issues of security, but also how we build those other partnerships in the region. So it cannot be and should never be the US to the exclusion of others, and building that out is critical, as well as ensuring that partners from outside of the region are as strongly engaged as possible. It's part of the reason for being here at GlobeSec, to have the discussions and to welcome European engagement in the region that shows economically and in other spheres that to all countries across the region, they have many partners and many choices.
In terms of
Can I also add on this issue? Taiwan faces a different set of questions. In Taiwan, we always come up with questions whether the United States is reliable. And the Chinese are taking this opportunity to bombard Taiwan with cognitive warfare, continue to tell Taiwan that the United States is not reliable. And they use the war in Ukraine and saying that the United States is not committed to Ukraine. And the war is started by the United States, and therefore we shouldn't trust the United States. And they use that to reduce Taiwan's relations with the United States. And they tell us that the conflict on the international stage is the conflict in between the United States on the one hand and China on the other. And Taiwan is a small guy, and therefore we should stay away from the United States to be safe. But that is the Chinese cognitive warfare, because they understand if Taiwan stays closer to the United States, it's going to be a stronger deterrence against China's aggression.
Thank you. On this partnerships, one thing that I've been hearing at this conference and that I hear a lot in Europe is the ideological framework of authoritarian countries versus democracies. Milos Vistrovic earlier just said, he said the same thing, talking about like-minded countries. And I want to ask each of you as well, to what extent this paradigm is useful. In Taiwan's case, former President Tsai, and also with this new administration as well, often frame it like this, as a group of democracies against the autocracies of the world. But of course, we see a lot of contradictions, right? I mean, the great example being the US's close relationship with Saudi Arabia. So I would like to ask each of you whether you think this ideological framework has its limits, whether it should continue to be used, or whether it's been over-leveraged. Secretary General.
To Taiwan, this is a very important matter. We like to be friends with those countries that share the same values with us, the values of freedom, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and etc. If you look at the European countries, those who develop closer ties with Taiwan are those countries that really treasure these kinds of value. And because of that, we are extending our diplomatic outreach to many countries in Europe. And it is the same with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and nowadays the Philippines as well. So when people share the same values, and when they do business or they conduct politics based on the same values, it's so much easier for us to make friends. And that remains to be a very important factor in our foreign policy.
Senator.
I'll be a little controversial here and say, as a binary proposition, it's counterproductive, because it drives much of the rest of the world to a binary choice. And if that choice is only the democracies or only the autocracies, well, it then comes down to, of course, how each plays those circumstances. And we can see in the way in which China is leveraging, alongside Russia, the BRICS, to try and gain greater sphere of influence across the global south, that there are risks there in that type of binary proposition. So absolutely, who are our most trusted confidants? Where are our strongest alliances? Well, with our like-minded liberal democracies and market economies. And it's why we should be using, for example, NATO, not to come and have a presence in a security sense in our region, but absolutely as a vehicle for like-minded liberal democracies to better share security knowledge, technology, understanding, and in the new domains like cyber and space that don't respect borders at all. Mm-hmm. But in terms of actually how we engage with the world to defend the rules that matter, to ensure that we are actually driving forward a engagement that creates that deterrence to underpin peace and stability in our region and elsewhere, well, we need to reach out to countries that are not necessarily democracies. And I referenced, just as a microcosm, I referenced the ASEAN countries before, or the 10 Southeast Asian nations. More diversity in a grouping of 10 you will rarely find when you look at different systems of government, different religious backgrounds and dominations across those countries, different stages of economic development, but their role is absolutely crucial in our region, and they are a great example of how we have to approach that type of diversity of engagement right around the world.
Martin, your thoughts? I mean, certainly President Pavel has said a lot about this framework.
Yeah, well, to me, at least in theory, this binary framework is useful up to a point, because ultimately that's what it's about. That's what's driving the re-emerging conflict. Like very different understanding of first the very architecture of the international relations, but also the very basics, like the relationship between an individual and the state, the role of human rights in politics. And these fundamental questions ultimately are what's behind all these conflicts, right? So in that sense, I think the framework still is useful, but of course in real life things get murky sometimes quite murky, and especially in complex times like we're facing today, sometimes people get strange bedfellows, right? Mm-hmm. Like they did during the Cold War, So I think there's theory and then there's practice, and they may not be the same.
I'm going to have one question for each of you, and then we're going to turn to the audience. And also, there are many questions on Slido, and I encourage everyone to upvote so that I will just pick the one that is at the very top. In terms of preparedness, you also mentioned cognitive warfare, right? Mm-hmm. So I want to ask a question to each of you about the psychology of all this. Let me stick to Martin. European policymakers, people in this room might understand the need to consider East Asia when you think about peace and security, even in Europe. But we both live here. I live in Berlin, you live in Prague, and we know that citizens really struggle to be convinced that East Asia is relevant. Can you comment on that? What needs to be done? Do you agree with my assessment of the feeling in Europe?
I absolutely agree, and I've learned the hard way because this is an issue I've been working on for almost 10 years now. So it's very difficult to deliver the message to the local populations. This geographically, this seems to be very distant from East Asia. It seems to be a different world, but I think particularly here in the Czech Republic, there's this growing sense of interconnectedness. That we cannot ignore what's happening on the other side of the world. The distance doesn't mean what it used to mean earlier. And, we just have to take that into consideration. So I think it's work in progress, right? We have to work on it. We have to try to persuade people there's arguments to be used. It's a slow work, but I think little by little we're getting there, and I think Europe as a whole has been through this process, has been going through this process for the last few years, and we've heard President von der Leyen yesterday. I don't think she would have used these words like only 5 years ago. So I think we're getting there slowly. Maybe too slowly.
Senator, in Australia, I understand that the conversation around China can be quite polarizing. Do you think that policymakers and government officials have failed in terms of communicating for the country how best Australia should engage with China to its citizens?
I think, so the Lowy Institute, one of our great foreign policy think tanks alongside the Institute of International Affairs and others in Australia, the Lowy Institute does an annual survey of Australian attitudes. And if you look back, not that many years ago, positively favourable disposition towards China and seeing it as a strong economic partner. In more recent times, much more negative, much more concerning, and far greater tendency to see it as a security threat. And so public sentiment has shifted a long way in that sense. And I think to the earlier question, yes, in a framing in our own countries, standing up for democracies and our own values are actually quite important for ensuring that people do understand. Then in the regional context, I think also understanding what is at threat. That Australians will care about the unfairness for the Taiwanese people if something horrific were to happen. But also understanding from a self-interest perspective, what does it mean if Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, or otherwise becomes a conflict zone, or becomes an area of greater control from the PRC? And if that were to occur, then that impacts all of our trade routes. We have enormous trade through North Asia, up into particularly Japan and South Korea, and so the risks to Australia there are real, and we have a task to ensure that those risks, those economic risks which flow on to the well-being of Australians, are well understood by our people as to why we invest in the relationships, the defence and the diplomacy to create that type of deterrence framework.
Thank you. Secretary General, again, I speak to people in Taiwan when I'm there, and they express frustration that Taiwan is often at the international level in terms of media coverage, only viewed as whether China is going to invade Taiwan or not. And they also, many of them tell me, and I was very surprised how many told me in Taiwan, that they do not believe China will invade Taiwan. They simply do not believe it. Some of them say they've been hearing that for decades and it hasn't happened. One can interpret that as meaning that the citizens of Taiwan are a little too sanguine about this possibility and are not taking the China threat seriously. So my question is, again, cognitive and psychological, but do you agree with this assessment from Taiwanese citizens, in terms of like my assessment of Taiwanese citizens, I mean, and how might your administration work to change that attitude, that people just, when you're constantly on alert, you eventually get used to it, you're dulled to that threat.
Right. And especially Taiwan is an industrial society or economic society, a very vibrant economic market. And therefore, people wanted to do their business, and they don't want China to stop their regular economic activities. So there seems to be a natural tendency to look at China's long-term threat against Taiwan as a rhetoric. But for decision makers in Taiwan, we don't have that kind of luxury. We cannot presume that China will attack or will not attack. We have to assume that China may attack at some point. And when that happens, we want to be ready. And that is the reason why we engage in military reforms. And we also engage in the broader security relations with other countries, primarily the United States. And at the same time, we are also engaging in whole of society resilience type of operation. It's a huge operation, including setting up a command system at a time of war. or trying to assure that we have sufficient stockpile of critical materials like food and water, energy, and etc. And we also want to ensure that Taiwan can survive Chinese cyber attacks. We want to be able to communicate with ourselves or with the outside world through satellite communication and etc. And we also want the society to be able to sustain if China wants to invade Taiwan. And our president has also launched a committee in the presidential office, and very soon we are going to make the first public meetings and public statements on how we prepare for a future. And I think that is an education process for the Taiwanese people as well. We need to be ready. We need to stay resilient, and we think that is the best way to deter against the Chinese aggression. If the Chinese think that they can take Taiwan over within a few hours, I think it's very dangerous. And many people are saying that weakness is inviting aggression. And we don't want to be in a weak position. We want to be strong. We want to be resilient. We want the Chinese to think that they won't be able to take Taiwan over within a short period of time. And I think that is the best deterrence for us.
Thank you. I'm looking at the slide of questions. The top question, I believe, you have just answered. So I'm going to the second one, and then I will then turn to the audience next. But first, the slide of question from Dennis. Are you afraid that the U.S. decision to boost its semiconductor industry might jeopardize the commitment to defend Taiwan in the future? That question is very much for you.
Well, I don't think that is the right way in looking at Taiwan's semiconductor industry relations with other countries. The TSMC is only one of those semiconductor manufacturers making investment in other countries. You know, they make investment in Phoenix, Arizona. They also come to Dresden, Germany, and they also go to Kumamoto, Japan. And the reason why they want to expand to other countries is because there is a need for more sophisticated chips, and there's not enough supply. So when Taiwan is limited in its capacity to expand anymore, they may want to expand their operations in other countries. And with their expansions in other countries, in the United States, in Germany, or in Japan, that is an extension of Taiwan's capability in the semiconductor industry. And that will only bring Taiwan closer to other countries economically. And when other countries feel that Taiwan still have that strength at the highest end of the semiconductor production, and I think the international community will continue to look at Taiwan's semiconductor output as one of the most critical factors for the international prosperity. And if you look at the joint statement or joint communiques coming from G7 or coming from European Summit, they continue to reiterate that peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait is indispensable to global security and prosperity. And that is because they look at the supply chain of semiconductor in Taiwan should not be disrupted. Otherwise, it's going to be a disaster for the international community.
Thank you. In the audience, that gentleman over there right up front, and then the second one will be that gentleman with the hand high in the middle. Yes, you've been waiting. So, and first of all, introduce yourself, and please do ask a question, no statement. Thank you.
I'm Lobsang Senge from Harvard University. I asked a similar question this morning at the European panel. What happens if there's a war in Taiwan or Himalayan region of India or Philippines? And most of the panelists were Europeans, a bit non-committal, so to speak. So I asked the same question, what happens if there's a war over Taiwan? What would Europe do, Australia do, Taiwan do? Because I say this, because I've been to many plenary conferences, where Hong Kongers also got plenary sessions, headline news, but actually when there's a clampdown, nothing happened from Europe or America.
But so the question is, what happens if there's a war, correct?
Yes, unless Taiwan is willing to fight for months, then only the international community is likely to come, following Ukraine model. Is Taiwan willing? Is Australia willing to put boots on the ground? Is NATO willing to come?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Start from me.
Always.
The determination of self-defense is very strong in Taiwan, and it's getting stronger. We will defend ourselves to the very end. And in order for us to be able to defend ourselves, we are engaging in military reform, we are investing more in our defense, and we engage a whole of society resilience. And talking about the critical supply of critical stockpiles of very important matters for us to stockpile, like energy and etc. We are looking at longer term because we want to be able to survive in the longer term. And I think that's the best way for Taiwan to stay resilient and for Taiwan to show itself as willing to defend itself. And when looking at this question, I very often would like to look at it from a different perspective. Knowing that war is going to bring disaster for the international community, look at the war in Ukraine. It's a disaster for the international community. And Taiwan's, if there's a war involving Taiwan, it's going to be much worse than the war in Ukraine. So the critical question is how can we stop war from happening? And I think that is in the mind of many important decision makers, including the decision makers in the United States. The war shouldn't stop, shouldn't happen at all. And we should have the enough strength to deter war from happening.
Thank you. We are very short on time. I don't know if you have any comments, just 30 seconds each in answer to that question, and I will take that last question over there.
Well, I don't want to dodge the question. I think firstly, thank you for acknowledging the other territorial claims and disputes. It's not just about Taiwan, but about Philippines, about Japan, about India, that the PRC does have a number of territorial claims and disputes that could see conflict move in a number of different directions. It is about deterrence, as I've said multiple times. Of course, for deterrence to be effective, people have to believe that you will be willing to use that deterrence as well. Now, that would all depend upon partnerships and how we move together, but we have to make sure, first and foremost, that deterrence is effective to prevent the conflict in the first place.
Thank you. Martin, I'm actually going to pass on you. If anyone wants the answer from Martin, go up to him after. But let's pass that last question to the gentleman. Please introduce yourself. Please make it a question. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Bryce Wakefield, and I'm the CEO of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. If Czech people think that Asia is remote, I'm going to go a little bit remoter, I think. Joseph Wu, about a quarter of your allies, the countries that recognize you are in the Pacific, and recently the Solomon Islands and Kiribati have switched from recognizing you to recognizing Beijing. At the same time, we have
I'm so sorry,
security
can you just cut
contestation in the
straight to
Pacific.
the question, please?
My question, and Australia is very concerned about that security contestation. My question is there, despite the sort of international status of Taiwan, are there areas where you can or do cooperate or consult on this problem?
Thank you.
Yes. For me, or
For both of you,
it's for
briefly
Senator.
for both. Yes.
Cool. So Taiwan's place in the world, to be clear, where nationhood or statehood is not a prerequisite, then we should absolutely be encouraging Taiwan's engagement in international affairs through the World Health Organization and World Health Assembly. The World Trade Organization, I'm a former trade minister. Taiwan sits there, Hong Kong SAR sits there. So there are absolutely precedents and models to ensure that we have that type of engagement. In terms of the Pacific Island nations, the criticality of them as part of the now permanent contest and competition is very real, and Australia has stepped up significantly under successive governments to deepen that engagement. We have to ensure that it is a respectful engagement too. It is about their empowerment, their sovereignty, just as much as we talk about the respect for sovereignty or the choice of individuals elsewhere.
Thank you. Secretary General, you get the last word.
Very briefly, if you look at China's actions in taking our diplomatic allies away in the Pacific, many people interpreted that as a diplomatic confrontation between China and Taiwan. But if you look at the reality of China's expansion of its influence in the Pacific, with Solomon Islands, with Kiribati, with Nauru, they try to turn these countries into China's like-minded countries, through education, through media manipulation, things like that. So we need to look at it from the perspective of China's expansion of its influence in the Pacific. And if we want to keep the Pacific free and open, I think we need to work together with other like-minded countries. And we've been working very closely with Australia in this regard now, which is good and very important.
Thank you very much. With that, we are going to end. Thank you, Secretary General Wu, Senator Birmingham, and Martin Hála. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. And we resume at the Havel stage at 5:05 for a conversation with Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you. Thank you.